this. Guten Morgen, Mama.
As the Third Reich collapsed, the women who shared their lives and ideals with the Nazi leaders faced an uncertain and grim fate. Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, lived an existence marked by isolation following her husband's drastic decisions. Rudolf Hess, sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg Trials, spent the rest of his life in Spandau Prison, where he died in 1987. For Ilse, this meant a definitive separation, leading her to bear the burden of loneliness while dealing with the void left by her husband. In an attempt to preserve his memory, Ilse wrote the book Rudolf Hess, Ich spreche die Wahrheit, in which she maintained his innocence and described him as a misunderstood idealist. Margarete Himmler, for her part, exemplified the values of the Nazi regime in her own life. With a serious personality and full of ideological conviction, Margarete fervently embraced the ideas of racial superiority and once proudly stated that they had built something the world would never forget. Welcome to the Wartime Archive. Margarete Himmler, the shadow wife of the Reichsführer. In 1927, Heinrich Himmler met Margarete Sigroth Boden during a train journey between Munich and Berchtesgaden. Margarete, then a divorced nurse, embodied the Aryan ideal according to the regime's standards: tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and Protestant. In contrast, Himmler was a far cry from the physical model he promoted. He was a thin, nearsighted man with marked insecurities about his appearance. At 27, his fragile health prevented him from participating in strenuous physical activity or enjoying large meals, which accentuated his personal discontent. Seeking to compensate for these insecurities, he found solace in the strict discipline and authority afforded by the Nazi uniform. In matters of love, Himmler had a fledgling record and publicly advocated sexual abstinence in his youth. However, over time, he expressed regret for that stance and revealed that he didn't have his first intimate experience until he was 28. In contrast, Margarete stood out for her confidence and attractiveness, which made her stand out in any setting. To get closer to her, Himmler began giving her books on topics related to his obsessions, such as the Freemasons and the supposed world Jewish conspiracy. These ideas resonated in a Germany plagued by prejudice and economic crisis, also capturing Margarete's attention. His ideological commitment was evident when he sold his stake in the clinic where he worked, justifying his decision with a prejudiced phrase, "A Jew always remains a Jew," referring to his partner. Despite being shy, Himmler persevered in his attempts at courtship. He sent her romantic letters, signing them "Your Landsknecht," a nickname evoking the fierce and solitary medieval German mercenaries. Margarete responded with messages full of optimism and shared dreams. "We must be happy." However, their relationship seemed to be based more on mutual affection than overwhelming passion. Margarete, 7 years older than Himmler, never managed to fit in with her husband's family. Himmler's deeply Catholic family was critical of her for being Protestant, divorced, and Prussian. Her nervousness and social awkwardness only fueled prejudices against her. Even Heinrich's mother expressed doubts about whether Margarete would damage the family's reputation. Despite the lack of acceptance, the couple were married on July 3, 1928, in Berlin-Schöneberg. The Himmler family was completely absent from the ceremony. Shortly after, on August 8, 1929, Gudrun Himmler was born, becoming her father's emotional center. With blue eyes and angelic charm, Gudrun, affectionately called Pupi, would be Heinrich Himmler's only legitimate child, and the child to whom he devoted much of his affection and attention. The name Gudrun was not a mere coincidence, but a choice laden with profound symbolism. Himmler, captivated by Germanic literature from a young age, likely chose it in honor of the Gudrun Saga, a work that celebrated the virtues of Nordic women, idealized as worthy of the greatest sacrifices on the part of men. However, after Gudrun's birth, Margarete did not conceive again, prompting the couple to adopt a boy, the son of an SS soldier who had fallen in combat. However, this child never found the affection he so desperately needed in his new family. In her diary, Margarete described him as a liar, a thief, and of a criminal nature, so he was sent first to a boarding school and then to a Napola, schools designed to train the Reich's elite. Meanwhile, Gudrun more than lived up to the family's expectations. Her mother described her as loving and gentle, and she quickly became the center of Margaret's attention, who often wrote in her diary how wonderful her beloved Pupi was. However, the family dynamic was far from idyllic. In 1928, after studying agricultural science at the University of Munich, Himmler invested his wife's dowry in a chicken farm in Waldtrudering, near the city. Both he and Margarete shared a romantic vision of rural life. However, day-to-day life was much less poetic. The hens barely laid eggs, the chicks frequently died, and the business soon sank into financial ruin. The management of the kennel fell almost entirely to Margarete, who also spent long hours alone caring for Gudrun. Himmler, absorbed by his political ambitions, was rarely present. The loneliness and financial strain began to wear on Margarete, leading her to become irascible and aggressive. Finally, in 1933, after selling the farm, they moved to the center of Munich. By then, Himmler had risen within the party, transforming from a man considered good but probably inconsistent by some colleagues into a key figure at the head of the Reich police apparatus. In 1936, he assumed the position of chief of the German police, consolidating his power as Reichsführer SS. Albert Speer described him as a peculiar mixture of schoolteacher and lunatic with extravagant ideas. This obsession with racial purity served Himmler to compensate for many of his own personal insecurities. During those years, the family moved to Tegernsee, in Upper Bavaria, where Himmler acquired a house in 1934. However, the demands arising from his party responsibilities continued to grow relentlessly. His presence at home became increasingly sporadic, leaving Margarete and Gudrun alone in a household where the paternal figure became increasingly blurred until it became a palpable absence. As time passed, Himmler began to adopt more liberal views on sexuality, presenting a marked contrast to the strict abstentionist beliefs of his youth. Despite understanding that Margarete was not to blame for not being able to bear him more offspring, Himmler refused to accept the limitations of monogamy, which he considered an invention of the Catholic Church and a work of the devil that should be eliminated. He based his arguments on an idealized vision of Germanic prehistory, where a nobleman could have multiple wives to secure his lineage. Himmler carried these ideas into the SS, allowing his officers to divorce or live with a second wife if they faced marital difficulties. He firmly believed that a man should not be limited to one partner for his entire life, and saw polygamy as a personal and collective solution. Several Nazi leaders shared this mentality. Joseph Goebbels, for example, had agreed with his wife on the right to extramarital relations, and Martin Bormann embraced a lifestyle in which his wife accepted her husband's mistresses and raised all their children under one roof. Within this context, Himmler promoted projects such as the Lebensborn Centers, founded in 1936. These centers encouraged the birth of Aryan women, offering a safe haven for unmarried mothers while keeping their status secret. Aiming to counteract the low birth rate that concerned the regime, Himmler even considered legalizing and encouraging births outside of marriage. At the same time, he sought to combat homosexuality through social gatherings for adolescents, hoping that youthful love could divert young people from what he considered a danger. In a 1937 speech, he stated that activities such as dance classes should offer opportunities for adolescents to fall in love, thus ensuring their normal development. Despite his liberal views on sexuality and his multiple political responsibilities, Himmler remained a devoted father. Although he separated from Margarete in 1940, he never formally divorced her out of respect for her and to maintain his relationship with Gudrun, his beloved daughter. He maintained constant communication with Püppi, as he often called her. The angelic, Aryan-looking girl was his pride and joy. Despite his constant travels, Himmler made it a point to be present in Gudrun's life, sending her photos, letters, and calling her frequently. Even in his busy schedule, he recorded every telephone conversation with his family, reflecting a paternal devotion that contrasted sharply with his growing involvement in the horrors of the National Socialist regime. When Heinrich Himmler was captured in 1945, he firmly identified himself. "My name is Heinrich Himmler." Shortly after, he died suddenly in British custody. Despite receiving medical attention, he could not be saved. Thus ended the life of one of the most feared men in the Third Reich. For Margarete Himmler, May 1945 marked a drastic turning point in her life. Until then, she had served as the wife of one of the most influential figures in the Nazi regime, protected by the privilege and status that position granted her. However, with the defeat of the Third Reich, her world collapsed. Just a couple of months later, on July 13th, she admitted to being aware of her husband's activities as head of the Gestapo. Not only did she express pride in him, but she emphasized that in Germany, a wife would never be questioned for her husband's actions. When Stringer asked her about her feelings regarding recent events, including Himmler's death, Margarete reacted with a coldness that surprised the journalist. She simply folded her hands and shrugged, projecting a disturbing indifference. Stringer described Margarete as an expressionless, almost emotionless woman, seemingly unable to assimilate the human and political impact that the defeat of the Nazi regime and the loss of her husband had brought. Margarete and her daughter Gudrun remained detained until November 1946 at Camp 77 for women in Ludwigsburg as part of the denazification process. During their incarceration, they were offered release. However, Margarete refused to leave. She claimed to have no financial resources, feared a possible lynching, and didn't know where to go. Eventually, they found refuge with a pastor named Bodil Schwing, who took them into a Protestant convent hospice where they were registered as supposedly mentally ill. During her stay at the convent, the nuns attempted to interact with Gudrun, but the girl remained distant and constantly repeated her desire to remain like her father, insisting on maintaining her Catholic faith. Although Himmler had renounced the church as an adult, he often prayed with his daughter every night, a habit that left a deep impression on Gudrun. The nuns noticed that the girl rarely showed emotion. She shed no tears or showed joy. Both remained at the convent until 1952 when they decided to leave. marking the beginning of a new chapter away from the religious refuge following the disasters of war, and her connection to one of the main architects of Nazism. Reintegrating into post-war German society was a challenge for Margarete. She survived mainly on a modest pension and the support of former SS comrades. She chose to keep a low profile, avoiding significant public appearances and maintaining an ambiguous stance regarding Nazism. She expressed no remorse for the regime's actions or for the actions of her husband. Margarete's exact role and level of knowledge about war crimes remain a matter of debate among German historians. Peter Longerich argues that she was likely unaware of the official secrets handled by Heinrich Himmler, but emphasizes that she strongly shared the regime's nationalist and anti-Semitic ideals. Jürgen Matthäus concurs with this perspective, adding that Margarete fully enjoyed the economic benefits derived from her husband's status and political position. Margarete Himmler died in Munich on August 25, 1967, at the age of 73. She spent her final years trying to remain anonymous while battling heart problems and diabetes, carrying with her the weight of the dark legacy to which she was inexorably linked. Henriette von Schirach, the wife of the Reich protector. The fate of Henriette von Schirach, wife of Baldur von Schirach, stands out as a peculiar case within the historical context of Nazism. Although she never openly opposed Adolf Hitler or the policies of the Nazi regime, she was known as one of the few women who dared to confront the leader of the Third Reich. Born on February 3, 1913, Henriette Hoffmann was the daughter of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. From an early age, she was immersed in the inner circle of the top Nazi leaders, as her family frequented gatherings where Hitler himself was a regular guest. It was in this environment that she grew up and forged her relationship with key party leaders. In 1932, at just 19 years old, she married Baldur von Schirach, an ambitious member of the National Socialist movement with significant influence within the regime. The wedding was emblematic, celebrated with Hitler as a witness in one of his private apartments. The couple, accustomed to a life of luxury and privilege, represented the ideal the party sought to project. Together they had 4 children and established themselves as influential figures both within National Socialism and in German society. Henriette eventually worked as Hitler's secretary, while Baldur led the Reich Youth and later held the position of Gauleiter in Vienna. The turning point in Henriette's life came in 1943. During a visit to Amsterdam, she witnessed the brutal deportation of Jews, a sight that deeply shocked her. Convinced that her privileged position would allow her to influence Hitler, she decided to confront him directly to express her outrage and demand restraint in such actions. However, this confrontation had disastrous consequences. In a tense conversation at the Berghof holiday residence, Hitler reacted with contempt. "That's the last thing I need, sentimentality about those Jewish women." After this incident, the ties between the von Schirachs and Hitler were completely severed.
After the collapse of the Nazi regime, Baldur von Schirach was tried in Nuremberg for crimes against humanity and sentenced to 20 years in prison. During that time, Henriette suffered the ravages common among wives of former Nazi leaders: loss of financial privileges, confiscation of property, and the indelible burden of a surname associated with the atrocities of the Third Reich. She also spent a year interned in a prison camp, where she was forced to perform humiliating tasks, as she later recounted in her memoirs.
In 1949, while Baldur was still serving his sentence in Spandau, Henriette decided to divorce him, and years later, remarried. Despite this, she continued fighting to recover some of the artwork confiscated during the regime, some from the possessions of deported Jews. In 1958, she even petitioned British Prime Minister Selwyn Lloyd for a reduction in her ex-husband's sentence, arguing that Baldur was not a criminal but a naive idealist whose kindness had led him to the wrong kind of political involvement. However, her request was rejected. Henriette channeled her experiences and perspectives into 3 works: The Price of Glory, 1956, Anecdotes About Hitler, 1980, and Women Around Hitler, 1983. These publications attempted to humanize Hitler, even describing him as a welcoming Austrian, which generated rejection among both historians and the public. Her lack of remorse for the regime's actions and her ambiguous stance cast a shadow over her legacy. Henriette von Schirach died on January 18, 1992. Although her life was marked by certain episodes of opposition to Nazism, she did not condemn either her husband or Hitler for their leading roles in the crimes of the Third Reich. Her figure will go down in history as another controversial example of those who remained visibly insensitive to the horror of the Holocaust, unable to take full responsibility or repent for their participation or complicity with the regime. Ilse Hess, in the shadow of the Reich ideologue, she was a deeply loyal wife to her husband, even in the most adverse times, and a fervent defender of National Socialism. Born in Hanover in 1900 as Ilse Pröll, she grew up in a family with deeply rooted conservative and nationalist ideas, an environment that decisively influenced her future political stance. In 1920, while studying economics at the University of Munich, she met Rudolf Hess, who would later become Adolf Hitler's deputy within the Nazi Party. The two quickly bonded over their ideological affinities and began a romantic relationship. Joining the Nazi Party and Hitler's inner circle early on, they married toward the end of 1927 in a ceremony that combined personal aspects with a marked political and ideological emphasis. With Hitler's rise to power, Rudolf gained greater prominence within the Nazi regime, enjoying the benefits derived from his closeness to the leader. Thanks to the trust Hitler placed in him, he was appointed deputy in 1933, a position he held until 1941. During these years, the couple lived in a luxurious residence in Munich, adjacent to the homes of other high-ranking members of the Nazi regime. There, they held frequent social gatherings with other leading families. In 1937, their son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, was born. Hitler served as godfather. Despite her close ties to the ruling elite, Ilse never sought to stand out among Nazi wives or compete with figures such as Magda Goebbels or Emmy Goering. She maintained a low profile until 1941, when the situation took a momentous turn. Rudolf was accused of treason after undertaking a risky, unauthorized flight to the United Kingdom with the intention of negotiating peace. The British imprisoned him, and Hitler dismissed and publicly scorned him. Suddenly, Ilse was left alone and dedicated to trying to rehabilitate her husband's name and standing within the Nazi leadership. With the fall of the Third Reich, Rudolf was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg Trials. Stripped of her property after the collapse of the regime, Ilse waged a relentless campaign for his release. During the final years of the Nazi regime, she had already been forced to defend her husband before former allies. After the war, she continued to fight for his cause, even facing political and social isolation. After being arrested and taken to the Augsburg-Göggingen internment camp, she was released in March 1948. From then on, She devoted her efforts to securing Rudolf's release by all available means. She sent letters to international leaders, appealed to former party comrades, and contacted German political figures from the post-war period. She also gave interviews in which she reiterated her lack of remorse for the regime's crimes, which made her a prominent figure within the neo-Nazi movement. In the following decades, she established herself as a writer committed to nationalism, publishing at least 4 books. Among her works is England, Nuremberg, Spandau, a Schicksal in Briefen, published by the nationalist publishing house Druffel Verlag, where she persisted in her defense of Hitlerian ideas and presented an admiring view of Hitler. Rudolf Hess didn't serve his full sentence, taking his own life in 1987 while incarcerated in Spandau Prison. Ilse died 8 years later in 1995, at the age of 95, having never abandoned her mission to vindicate her husband's name and memory. Margarete Speer, the woman in the shadows of the architect of the Third Reich. Margarete Speer was the wife of Albert Speer, a leading figure of the Nazi regime known as the architect of the Third Reich, and head of the Ministry of Armaments and Arms Production during World War II. Margarete Weber, her birth name, was born on September 8, 1905, in Heidelberg, the daughter of a prosperous craftsman. Despite her humble origins, she met Albert Speer in 1922, but his family initially rejected the relationship, considering her socially inferior. Nevertheless, the two were married in August 1928, a wedding that most of the Speers refused to attend. Margarete also did not visit her in-laws until much later, when their relationship was more established. The couple had 6 children, but their union was far from ideal. Albert immersed himself completely in his career within the Nazi regime, where he became a crucial figure not only as an architect, but also as someone close to Adolf Hitler. Meanwhile, Margarete tried to stay out of politics, dedicating herself to raising their children and assuming the role expected of a model wife in that context. However, the impact of Albert's key role in the Nazi war machine, responsible for massive arms production, was impossible to ignore, and Margarete was aware of the crimes associated with the regime. With the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, her life took a drastic turn. During the Nuremberg Trials, Margarete faced interrogation, while Albert Speer presented himself to the world as one of the few repentant Nazis. He worked to construct the myth of the good Nazi, claiming to be unaware of many of the regime's crimes and simply fulfilling his duties within the administrative structure. Margarete remained by his side throughout this narrative reconstruction, demonstrating unwavering loyalty even when circumstances changed radically. After being sentenced, Albert spent 20 years in Spandau Prison. During that time, Margarete lost everything: property, assets, and financial stability. Even so, she raised her 6 children alone and with almost no resources, although she received occasional support from former members of the Nazi Party. When Albert was finally released, his family relationships were already irreparable. He barely maintained contact with his children and failed to repair his bond with Margarete. In the following years, Albert continued to consolidate his public image as the good Nazi. He was the subject of numerous interviews, collaborated with historians, and appeared on television programs. However, his life ended abruptly in 1981, after suffering a stroke while participating in a program in London. He died there on September 1st, accompanied by another German woman with whom he had begun a relationship while living in the British capital. Despite never officially divorcing, his marriage to Margarete was emotionally fractured long before then. She kept a low profile after Albert's death and lived to the age of 82. She was buried in the family tomb in Heidelberg, faithful to her husband's memory until the end, and a tireless defender of his legacy, Anneliese von Ribbentrop, the wife of Hitler's emissary. Anna Elisabeth Henkel, wife of Joachim von Ribbentrop, who served as foreign minister during the Nazi era from 1938 to 1945, was born in Wiesbaden on January 21, 1896. Coming from an aristocratic family linked to champagne production, they amassed a vast fortune in the sector. Her father, Otto Henkel, owned the Henkel & Company, Sektkellerei Company, which allowed Anna to grow up surrounded by luxury and in a highly influential social environment. It was in this context that she met Joachim while playing a tennis match. At the time, he held the rank of first lieutenant and had been part of a mission based in Constantinople. The couple married on July 5, 1920, in Wiesbaden. They settled in Berlin-Dahlem and had 5 children. Their residence became a meeting point for Nazi leaders from 1932 onwards, following Joachim's membership in the party. Joachim, impressed by Adolf Hitler's oratory and charisma, formally joined the NSDAP in May of that same year, a step Anneliese was quick to follow. Joachim's role in Hitler's final rise to power proved strategic. He leveraged his connections to facilitate key negotiations between Chancellor Franz von Papen and Hitler in 1931 and 1932, a crucial period in the transition from the Weimar Republic to the Third Reich. The private meetings he organized with his family played a pivotal role, earning Joachim recognition from Hitler and subsequent appointments as a diplomat and foreign minister. In this context, Anneliese enjoyed the privileges of the regime: wealth, social prestige, trips abroad with her husband, and the opportunity to receive political and diplomatic figures at her residence. However, she also shared the party's ideologies and its involvement in the dynamics of the regime. The role played by Joachim von Ribbentrop led to his death sentence by the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946. During her time in prison, Anneliese visited him frequently and testified in his defense. After his execution on October 16th of that year, Anneliese's life changed radically. She found herself in a precarious situation, economically deprived, socially isolated, and with her surname marked by the crimes of Nazism. In an initial attempt to escape to the Rhineland, she was arrested and imprisoned in the Dachau internment camp. Despite the adversities, Anneliese dedicated her efforts to disseminating her husband's posthumous writings and even published a book on the causes of World War II. Although she never publicly defended the regime's actions or the decisions of Joachim or Hitler, she remained loyal throughout the trial. Aware of the stigma attached to her name, she later tried to live in relative anonymity to protect her children. Thanks to her privileged upbringing and wealthy background, she managed to recover part of her family inheritance and enjoy a less austere life compared to other wives linked to Nazism. He died on October 5, 1973, at the age of 77. For the rest of his life, he carried the historical burden associated with the name von Ribbentrop, showing no remorse for the ideological convictions he held during that dark period in history. Gerda Bormann, the woman behind the Führer's confidant. Gerda Buch, wife of one of the most influential Nazi leaders and personal secretary to Adolf Hitler, traveled a path that led her from being a maternal role model for the regime to a tragic end in the years following the war. Born on October 23, 1909, in Konstanz, Gerda grew up in an environment deeply influenced by the ideas of the National Socialist Party, instilled by her father, Walter Buck, a prominent party official since the 1920s. It was at meetings with her father that Martin Bormann, Gerda's future husband, met her at a very young age. At the time, Buck served as head of the Commission of Inquiry and Conciliation, which was responsible for mediating internal party disputes, and was frequently visited by important Nazi figures, including Adolf Hitler. At 19, Gerda married Bormann in a ceremony sponsored by the Führer himself and Rudolf Hess. Over the next 12 years, the couple had 10 children, perfectly in line with Nazi principles that promoted the procreation of Aryan Germans and venerated the role of women as key elements of the regime in their role as mothers. Gerda not only fulfilled these ideals, but was a fervent defender of National Socialism. She openly supported her husband and fully shared his political vision and actions. Her loyalty went so far as to publicly tolerate Bormann's extramarital affair with actress Manja Behrens. Furthermore, she promoted initiatives such as the creation of a Nordic reproductive community that conformed to the Aryan racial standards advocated by the regime. With Hitler's rise to power, Martin quickly rose through the Nazi hierarchy, becoming the Führer's personal secretary after Rudolf Hess's expulsion in 1941. During this time, Gerda lived surrounded by luxury and privilege in Obersalzberg, while supporting her husband in his rising political career. However, the fall of the Third Reich marked a radical turning point in her life. With the disappearance of Martin Bormann after the end of the war, Gerda was identified as the wife of one of the most wanted Nazis and detained in various centers. She lost everything: her social position, her financial resources, and any vestige of influence. Although she was finally released in 1946, she was unable to overcome the difficulties of reintegrating into a society that singled her out for her past and the weight of her husband's criminal legacy. She moved to Italy with her children but faced poverty and social isolation. Her situation was exacerbated by illness. After being diagnosed with cancer, she died on March 23, 1946, in Merano, leaving her 10 children orphaned. The paths of the wives of Nazi leaders varied considerably after the regime's collapse. Although they faced diverse fates, they all shared the stigma and social consequences of being partners with leaders implicated in war crimes. They quickly went from luxury to poverty and had to choose between repenting for the past or fighting to vindicate their husbands. Some remained loyal to Nazism until the end, while others chose to seek a new beginning in anonymity. Emmy Goering, the First Lady of the Reich. For various reasons, Emmy Sonnemann embodied the ideal of the Nazi wife according to the regime's standards and expectations. Her role made her one of the trio who for years vied for the symbolic title of First Lady of the Third Reich, along with Magda Goebbels and Eva Braun. Born in Hamburg in 1893, Emmy grew up in a wealthy family that owned a chocolate factory. Thanks to her talent and imposing physical figure, Emmy began a distinguished acting career at the age of 20, appearing in numerous silent films and plays that earned her considerable acclaim. In 1916, she married actor Karl Köstlin, but they divorced a decade later, marking the beginning of a radical change in Emmy's life. During this period, she met Hermann Göring, one of the main leaders of the Nazi Party and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. In 1934, while Göring was president of the Reichstag, Emmy was awarded the title of Prussian State Actress. The following year, the two were married in a public event that became a massive media spectacle. Adolf Hitler served as best man, while fighter planes flew overhead and a parade of 30,000 soldiers accompanied the ceremony, which culminated at the Reich Chancellery. A British ambassador is said to have remarked during the event that it seemed as if Germany had restored the monarchy, As the wife of a high-ranking Nazi, Emmy dutifully fulfilled the expected role. She enthusiastically organized social gatherings for the party elite, publicly supported the decisions of her husband and the Führer, and gave birth to her only child, Edda, in 1938. Hermann Göring even declared that German women should simply pick up a pot, a dustpan, a broom, and marry a man. Emmy not only lived up to these ideals, but also exalted them, unconditionally supporting the regime. She often hosted prominent international figures such as the Duke of Windsor, Charles Lindbergh, Prince Paul of Yugoslavia, Swedish Crown Prince Gustav Adolf, and King George of Greece at her mansion. This prominence aroused suspicion among the leading wives of the Nazi regime. Indeed, her tensions with Eva Braun led Hitler to personally intervene, demanding that Emmy show respect for Braun or threatening to ban her from returning to Berghof. During the Nazi years, Emmy and her husband enjoyed an opulent life financed by systematic looting, particularly through the plundering of art belonging to deported Jewish families. Their downfall began after the end of the regime. In 1946, while facing imminent execution after the Nuremberg Trials, Hermann Göring committed suicide by ingesting cyanide. Emmy and her daughter Edda were arrested and imprisoned by the Allies, where they were subjected to abuse by the guards. Upon their release, they found themselves impoverished after all their possessions were confiscated, including a collection of paintings valued at more than $3.6 billion in today's dollars. Emmy also lost her fabulous wardrobe, considered the largest in Europe, leaving only 2 dresses. In 1947, a denazification court sentenced her to forced labor due to her active involvement with the Nazi Party. She later settled into a small apartment in Munich, where she lived for the next few years, facing social isolation and the difficulties of reintegrating into German society. Without luxuries or influence, Emmy spent her days grappling with the weight of her past. Although her media appearances were limited, she never expressed regret and always defended her husband until the end of her life. In a 1951 interview, she claimed to be apolitical during the Nazi era and asserted that Hermann always acted with good intentions. In 1967, she published a book in which she presented a more forceful defense of her ex-husband, entitled An der Seite meines Mannes, translated as Göring, my husband. In this work, she reinforced her position that she had not been involved in politics and described Hermann as an exemplary husband and father. She also suggested that Germany's fate would have been more favorable if her husband had assumed power instead of Hitler, whom she described as mentally challenged. Emmy died on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80. Although she did not become a fervent supporter of Nazism in the post-war period, she also showed no remorse for her actions or those of her husband. Magda Goebbels, the tragic muse of the Third Reich. For 13 years, Eva Braun remained at the Führer's side, although she never achieved the public prominence enjoyed by Magda Goebbels, considered the true First Lady of National Socialism. Born on November 11, 1901, in Berlin, Magda was the daughter of Auguste Behrendt, a maid and probably the engineer Oskar Rischel, who married Auguste but did not give his surname to the girl. After her divorce from Gunther Quandt in 1929, Magda began attending the Nordic Club, an institution founded in 1909 that promoted Nordic superiority and at the time openly sympathized with Nazism. Her connection with the Nazi Party intensified when she attended a Goebbels rally at the Sports Palace. Shortly after she joined the party, and thanks to her social circle was well received, becoming deeply involved from the outset. In 1930, she was appointed Goebbels' secretary. Goebbels' diaries and accounts from contemporaries reveal that the two quickly fell in love. While Magda was blindly adored by Joseph Goebbels, her enthusiasm for Adolf Hitler was even greater. They developed a close relationship, and she entered his restricted female circle of friends. The Führer said of her, "This woman could play an important role in my life, even if I don't marry her. She could be the feminine opposite of my masculine instincts." In December 1931, less than a year and a half after the rally at the Sports Palace, Magda responded to Goebbels' pleas by marrying him. Curiously, the wedding took place on the Quandt family estate in Severin. However, her true fascination was not with Goebbels, but with Hitler, whom she admired almost deliriously. The Führer even acted as best man at the wedding on December 19, 1931. Magda joined the Nazi leader's inner circle, and her relationship with Hitler became a platonic complement to the one she shared with Goebbels. The three formed a trio in which Magda played the role of the Führer's muse and consort to his deputy. After their marriage, the Goebbelses moved to a luxurious mansion on Reichskanzlerplatz, which became the center of parties and gatherings for Berlin's high society and the operational headquarters of the leader of the Third Reich. In the following years, the couple had 6 children, whose names began with the letter H in honor of their adored leader: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdin, Hedwig, and Heidrun. Magda was the first woman to be awarded the German Mother's Cross of Honor, an award that made her a role model for German mothers. The personal relationship between Magda and Hitler remains shrouded in speculation and mystery. Some even claim they were formally romantic. On one occasion, Magda confessed to the regime's filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, "I also love my husband, but my love for Hitler is stronger. For him, I would be willing to leave this world." However, beyond this intimate comment directed at Riefenstahl, there is no concrete evidence to confirm such a relationship. Given the magnetism and power Hitler managed to accumulate, it is not difficult to imagine that any influential woman in the Third Reich could have been romantically linked to him in similar rumors. In the months before coming to power, Hitler spent long periods in Berlin. The Goebbels family welcomed him with open arms to their residence in the exclusive Reichskanzlerplatz district. Magda, who had left behind her life as a wealthy and decadent bourgeois lady, became the archetypal National Socialist housewife. Every day, she personally prepared Hitler's meals and delivered them to the hotel where he resided while fulfilling his duties as a candidate for chancellor. In the evenings, the Nazi Party elite gathered at the Goebbels home where crucial decisions were made. Figures later to become infamous within the National Socialist regime passed through that house: Hermann Göring, Ernst Röhm, and the ruthless Heinrich Himmler, who at the time was only head of the still insignificant SS. They all enjoyed Magda's hospitality, her dishes, and her conversation. Meetings at Reichskanzlerplatz often lasted until the early hours of the morning. There, the most influential leaders of the Nazi movement hatched their plans to demolish the remnants of the Weimar Republic and prepare for the rise of the future regime. On January 30th, 1933, those plans culminated successfully when Hitler was tasked with forming a government, marking the official launch of Germany as a National Socialist state. The Goebbelses were in the front line to enjoy the triumph. Joseph, a member of the party since its most militant beginnings, dreamed of leading the Ministry of Education and Culture to realize his propaganda utopias. However, Hitler offered him something much more suited to his talents: the newly created Ministry of Information and Propaganda, practically tailor-made. Having assumed their new roles as prominent figures in the regime, the Goebbelses settled into a mansion befitting their position, Prince Leopold's residence. Shortly thereafter, the local authorities presented them with another property on the shores of Lake Bogen in Lanka, a Prussian complex that Magda remodeled into a luxurious estate consisting of 5 buildings. One of these featured 21 rooms equipped with innovative technologies for the time, such as air conditioning and electric blinds, details that revealed the extreme luxury in which they lived. Despite her family's new status, Joseph Goebbels did not allow Magda access to all the spaces under his control. The minister ordered the construction of a private castle reserved exclusively for her personal use. He decorated it in deep reds and used it as an office, as well as an occasional setting for encounters with his lovers. These extravaganzas were not isolated among the leaders of the Nazi regime. They represented a frequent facet of the power so desired by those who governed during that dark period of German history. However, the life of Germany's most famous couple was not destined to be completely idyllic. At one point, an extramarital affair between Goebbels and a young Czech actress of only 22 years old came to light, leaving a significant mark on Magda. Although she herself had had her own amorous indiscretions, this event affected her deeply. Convinced of the strength of her relationship with the Führer, Magda decided to ask him for permission to divorce her husband, without anticipating the political and social repercussions of such a request. A divorce would have generated an enormous scandal, damaging the public image the Nazi regime was trying to project and particularly tarnishing the reputation of the propaganda minister. Hitler, firm in his refusal, responded with a resounding no. This clear and definitive decision stunned Magda, who abruptly understood who truly controlled both her life and the destiny of Germany. While Hitler devoted all his efforts to transforming Germany into an invincible empire destined to last 1,000 years, he avoided marriage until almost the end of his life. Magda, for her part, found in this dynamic an opportunity to shine. Rivaling the Führer's romantic partner, she managed to establish herself as the regime's first lady thanks to her own skill and influence. She was a constant presence at Nazi party events and celebrations, while fulfilling the expectations of her as a mother to numerous children. On April 22, 1945, with Soviet troops surrounding Berlin, the Goebbelses asked Hitler for permission to accompany him to the bunker. As a gesture of recognition for her unconditional loyalty, Hitler presented Magda with the gold party badge he wore on his lapel. This act represented the high point of her career and at the same time, the prelude to a tragic end. On April 28th, confined to her room in the bunker, Magda wrote to her son Harold, who was serving in the Luftwaffe, "Our splendid idea is sinking, and with it everything beautiful, admirable, noble, and good that I have known in my life. The world that will follow the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in. That is why I have brought the children." 2 days later, Hitler committed suicide, thus ending his own life, his atrocious regime, and a world war he himself had started. Soon after, Magda faced her dark end. With implacable coldness, she and her 6 children entered a room. She administered sleeping pills followed by lethal injections. One by one, they fell into eternal sleep. The eldest was 12, the youngest had not yet reached 5. Hours later, Goebbels prepared to follow her in death. Dressed with deliberate calm and carefully adjusting his khaki cap, he and a few guards climbed outside the bunker. Following strict orders after suicide, their bodies were to be cremated to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands as macabre trophies. He chose the shot. Magda opted for cyanide. Thus came the end. Magda Goebbels, born Berend, adopted Friedländer and Rietschel, and leaving behind her marital name, Quandt, ceased to exist. When Soviet soldiers discovered her charred remains, they were provisionally buried in the gardens of the KGB headquarters in Magdeburg. Some 25 years later, they were exhumed and finally reduced to ashes, which were scattered in the Elbe River. Not even in her worst nightmares could Magda have imagined such a grim and final outcome.